My daughter asked me not to attend her wedding. At 9:42 p.m., her groom called me instead. The day my own daughter asked me not to come to her wedding, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just said, "Okay, sweetheart," and hung up the phone like a man who'd been shot but hadn't noticed yet. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I'm 44 years old, and I've spent the last 26 years of my life trying to be the kind of father my own dad never managed to be. I run a small commercial construction company outside Columbus, Ohio, Whitfield and Sons, even though I only ever had one child, a daughter named Emily, and I named the company that back when she was 6 years old and told me she wanted to build skyscrapers someday. I never changed the sign. Some promises you don't take down just because life gets complicated. I raised Emily mostly on my own. Her mother, Carla, left when Emily was 9, moved to Arizona with a man she met at a work conference, and for a long time it was just me and my girl in a 3-bedroom house on Larchmont Drive, figuring out braids and math homework, and later boy trouble together. I coached her softball team for 4 years even though I couldn't hit a curveball to save my life. I sat in the front row of every school play. I worked 60-hour weeks so she could go to Ohio State without loans hanging over her head. And when she graduated, I cried in the parking lot before I even got to the ceremony because I didn't want her to see me lose it. I tell you all this not to make myself sound like some kind of saint. I made mistakes. I worked too much some years. I dated a woman named Patricia for 8 months when Emily was in high school and it ended badly, and Emily never really forgave me for how messy that got. But I showed up. Every single day of her life, I showed up. That's the only thing I ever really promised her. So when my phone rang on a Tuesday evening in March and I saw Emily's name on the screen, I answered it smiling, the way you do with your kid, even after all these years. "Hey, Em." There was a long pause, long enough that I almost asked if she was still there. "Dad," she said, "I need to talk to you about the wedding." Emily was getting married in 6 weeks to a man named Grant Sorensen, sharp suits, sharper smile, the kind of guy who shakes your hand a little too hard so you know he practiced it. I'd met him 4 times. Every time, something in my gut told me to watch him, but I told myself that was just an old father's instinct, the kind every dad has about the man taking his daughter. "What about it?" I said. "I think it would be better," she said, and her voice was doing something I'd never heard it do before, flat, rehearsed, like she was reading off a card someone else had written, "If you didn't come." I sat down on the edge of my bed. The house was quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming down in the kitchen. "Didn't come to what, honey?" "The wedding, Dad. Grant's family, it's a lot of important people, and things are complicated with you being there, and I think it would be easier for everyone if you sat this one out." 26 years, every school play, every hospital visit, every 2 a.m. phone call when she was in college and scared and needed her dad to talk her down. And now I was complicated. I didn't yell. "I want you to understand that about me. I have never once raised my voice at my daughter in her entire life, and I wasn't about to start now over the phone 6 weeks before her wedding." "Okay, sweetheart," I said, "if that's what you want." "Dad, it's not, I don't want this, it's just—" "It's fine, Em," I said, and I meant it to sound gentle, but my voice cracked right in the middle of the word fine, and I think we both heard it. "I love you. I hope it's a beautiful day." I hung up before she could say anything else, because I didn't trust myself not to fall apart on the phone with my little girl, and the last thing I ever wanted her to hear was her father breaking. That night I sat in my kitchen until almost midnight with a cup of coffee I never drank, staring at a photograph on the wall, Emily at 7 years old, gap-toothed, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. I kept asking myself what I had done. What had changed? Because something had changed and it wasn't me. For the first 2 weeks after that call, I told myself it was Grant's family being difficult, some old money thing, some snobbery about a man who builds parking garages for a living instead of running hedge funds. I could live with that. I didn't need to understand it to accept it, even if it broke something in my chest every time I thought about it. But then my sister Diane called me on a Sunday afternoon, and everything started to look different. "Danny," she said, "she's the only person alive who still calls me that. I ran into Carla at the Kroger on Sawmill Road. Carla, my ex-wife, Emily's mother. The woman who left when Emily was 9 and had spent the better part of 15 years sending birthday cards 2 weeks late and showing up to maybe one graduation out of 3. Okay, I said carefully, and... She's going to the wedding, Danny. She's walking Emily down the aisle. I actually laughed because it was such an absurd thing to hear that my brain didn't know what else to do with it. That's not Diane, I'm sure you misheard. I didn't mishear anything. She told me herself she's proud of it, said Emily asked her personally months ago. Diane's voice softened. Danny, did you know about this? I hadn't known, not one word of it. Not from Emily, not from Carla, not from anybody. I had been quietly, methodically erased from my own daughter's wedding, and I hadn't even seen it happening. I want to tell you that I got angry right then. I didn't. What I got was still. Very, very still, the way you get when you're standing at the edge of something and you haven't decided yet whether you're going to jump or step back. I started paying attention. Really paying attention, the way I hadn't let myself before, because for 6 weeks I'd been so busy nursing my own wound that I hadn't stopped to ask a much more important question. Why? Why now? Why me? Why would Emily, my Emily, who used to fall asleep on my chest during Sunday football games, who used to call me every single time something good or bad happened in her life before she called anyone else? Why would she suddenly, 6 weeks before her wedding, decide her own father was too complicated to attend? I started with something simple. I called my accountant. Now I should explain something here. 11 years ago, my mother, Emily's grandmother, a woman named Ruth Whitfield who worked 40 years as a school nurse and never made more than $38,000 in her life, passed away and left behind a modest but real inheritance. Land in Licking County that had been in the family since the 1950s, worth considerably more now than anyone in 1975 could have imagined, given how the suburbs had crept out that direction. My mother's will left that land jointly to me and to Emily, in trust until Emily turned 30, with me as the trustee until then. Emily was about to turn 30 in 4 months. I hadn't thought about that land in years. It sat there quietly, appreciating, a nest egg for my daughter's future, exactly the way my mother intended it. Dan, my accountant, a steady, careful man named Harold Prout who'd done my books for 18 years, said when I called him that Sunday night, "Why are you asking me about the Licking County Trust?" "Just want to check on it. Anything unusual?" There was a pause on the line I didn't like the sound of. "Dan, I got a call 3 weeks ago from an attorney representing a man named Grant Sorensen. He was asking about the terms of the trust. Specifically, what happens to the asset upon Emily's marriage and whether the trustee designation could be transferred." The room felt very cold all of a sudden. "Transferred to who?" He didn't say directly, Dan, but given the nature of the questions, Harold hesitated. It sounded like they were trying to figure out if a husband could gain some kind of control or claim over the land once Emily turned 30 and the trust dissolved. I told them I couldn't discuss it without your authorization, and I didn't hear back. I sat there holding the phone long after Harold said goodbye. My daughter's fiancé had hired a lawyer to investigate my mother's inheritance 3 weeks before telling my daughter I shouldn't come to the wedding. I didn't know yet exactly what was happening, but I knew, with the kind of certainty that settles into your bones, that this was not about Grant's family being uncomfortable with a blue-collar father-in-law. This was about money, my mother's land, and somehow my daughter had gotten caught in the middle of it without even knowing. I want to tell you something about myself right here, because it matters for everything that comes after. I'm not a man who screams. I'm not a man who shows up somewhere and makes a scene. My own father did that, drank too much, yelled too loud, made every family gathering into something you had to survive rather than enjoy. And I swore when Emily was born that I would never let her flinch at the sound of my voice the way I used to flinch at his. So I didn't call Emily and accuse her of anything. I didn't call Grant and demand answers. I did something much quieter, much slower, and honestly, much more dangerous for anyone who was lying to me. I started building a file. I went to Harold first and asked him to document, formally and in writing, every contact he'd had regarding the trust, dates, and all. Then I drove out to the Licking County Recorder's office myself on a Wednesday morning and pulled the public records on the land, just to make sure nothing had been quietly altered. Everything was still clean, still in my name as trustee, still set to transfer fully to Emily on her 30th birthday. No strings, exactly as my mother intended. Then I did something I'm not entirely proud of, but I don't regret it either. I called my old friend Marcus Webb, who's been a private investigator in Columbus for almost 20 years. A man I helped out once when his roof needed emergency repair after a storm, and he never forgot it. "I don't want you digging into my daughter," I told him. "I want you to find out who Grant Sorensen really is." It took Marcus 11 days. What he found made my hands shake the first time I read the report. Grant Sorensen was not, as he told Emily and told me, a senior consultant for a Columbus investment firm. He had been let go from that firm 14 months earlier, quietly after what the internal paperwork Marcus obtained referred to only as a material breach of client trust. He was, in fact, roughly $200,000 in personal debt, most of it tied to a failed real estate venture in Florida that had gone under 2 years before. And this was not, as I had believed, his first marriage. He had been married once before to a woman named Alicia Ray Sorensen for just under 3 years. That marriage had ended in a divorce that included, buried in court filings Marcus dug up from Hillsborough County, Florida, allegations that Grant had attempted to have Alicia's family trust, her late father's construction business, restructured in his favor before the marriage fell apart. The judge in that case had specifically noted, in the settlement, language protecting Alicia's family assets from any future claim by Grant. He had done this before, or tried to. I sat at my kitchen table with that folder for a long time that night, the same table where Emily used to do her algebra homework, where I used to help her sound out vocabulary words in 3rd grade, and I felt something in me that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief. It was something closer to clarity. My daughter was about to marry a man who I now believed, with real evidence in front of me, had a pattern, a practiced, deliberate pattern, of marrying into money and maneuvering to control it. And somehow, in the space of a few months, that man had convinced my daughter that her own father was the problem. I needed to understand that part before I did anything else, because Emily is not a foolish woman. She's sharp, she's careful, she went into that engineering program at Ohio State and graduated with honors. Someone had worked very hard to turn her against me, and I needed to know how. The answer came from an unlikely place, Emily's best friend since middle school, a young woman named Priya Nair, who I'd known since she was 11 years old eating popsicles on my back porch. Priya called me out of nowhere on a Thursday night, her voice shaking. "Mr. Whitfield, I don't know if I should be calling you, but I can't stay quiet anymore." She told me things that broke my heart into pieces I'm still finding. Grant had spent the better part of 8 months, slowly and carefully, telling Emily things about me. Not big, dramatic lies, small ones, the kind that are hard to trace back to a source, the kind that work precisely because they're subtle. That I'd said something disparaging about Grant's family at a dinner Emily hadn't even attended. That I'd made a comment about their wedding budget being wasteful, which I had never said. That an old, painful moment from Emily's teenage years, when I dated Patricia and things ended badly, had somehow been recast and exaggerated into a story about me being controlling and difficult to please. A story Grant had apparently repeated to Emily more than once, always gently, always with an "I just worry about you, that's all." "He never told her to cut you out directly," Priya said. "He's smarter than that, he just kept watering the seed. Every few weeks, something small. By the time the wedding got close, Emily believed she'd come to the decision about you all on her own." I thanked Priya. I told her she was one of the bravest people I knew for calling me. And then I hung up the phone and sat alone in my house and let myself cry for the first time since this whole thing started, not out of self-pity, but because I finally understood the shape of what had been done to my daughter, and it was worse than anything I'd imagined. She hadn't rejected me. She'd been given a version of me that wasn't real, one piece at a time, until she couldn't see through it anymore. Now I had a choice to make. I could call Emily and tell her everything I'd learned, the debt, the ex-wife, the lawyer asking about the trust, Priya's account of the slow poisoning of her opinion of me. Some part of me wanted to. I wanted to protect her that night more than I have ever wanted anything. But I also knew Emily. I knew that if I called her up and dumped all of this on her over the phone, 6 weeks before her wedding, with no proof she could hold in her hands and look at herself, it would sound exactly like what Grant had spent 8 months preparing her to expect, her difficult, controlling father trying to sabotage her happiness one last time. He had built himself an insurance policy. Any accusation I made without proof would only prove his story right. So I decided to do what I do best. I built something slowly, carefully, with my own 2 hands, the same way I've built every project in 22 years of running my company. Not a case built on accusations, a case built on documents. Over the next 4 weeks, I worked with Harold to get everything about the trust in writing, time-stamped, and notarized. I had Marcus formalize his findings on Grant's financial history and his first marriage into a clean, factual report, with copies of the actual Florida court filings attached. Nothing embellished, nothing exaggerated, just the truth, laid out where anyone could read it for themselves. I asked Priya, gently, if she would be willing to write down what she'd told me, in her own words, and she agreed without hesitation, because she said Emily deserved to know the truth more than she deserved to be protected from finding out how she'd been misled. And then I did one more thing, the thing I'm least proud of and most certain was necessary. I called Grant Sorensen myself. I asked him to meet me for coffee, alone, man to man. I told him about the wedding. He agreed, probably assuming I wanted to make peace, or maybe assuming he'd already won. We met at a diner off Route 161 on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I didn't accuse him of anything. I sat across from him, and I asked, very calmly, whether he had any questions for me about the Licking County property my mother left for Emily, since I understood his attorney had reached out to my accountant about it. I watched his face change in real time. The easy smile flickered just for a second before he rebuilt it. "I don't know what you're talking about, Dan," he said. "That's interesting," I said, "because I have Harold Pruitt's written notes from the call with the date and your attorney's name on it." I slid a single sheet of paper across the table, not the whole file, just enough to let him know I wasn't guessing. "I also had a very informative conversation with someone in Hillsborough County, Florida, about your first marriage." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then quietly, almost admiringly, he said, "You've been busy." "I've been a father," I said. "That's all I've ever been busy being." I told him plainly that I had no interest in causing a scene, that I wasn't going to show up at his wedding and throw a punch or make a speech nobody asked for. I told him I loved my daughter more than my own life, and that if he truly loved her too, he would tell her the truth himself, before the wedding, in his own words, and give her the chance to make her decision with a clear head and real information instead of a carefully managed story. He looked at me for a long time, then he said, "And if I don't?" "Then I will," I said, "not to hurt you, to protect her. That's the only reason any of this matters to me." He didn't call Emily that week, or the next. So 4 days before the wedding, I did what I had promised him I would do only if he left me no other choice. I didn't ambush her. I didn't send some dramatic email or drop the folder on her doorstep. I called her and asked if she would come by the house, just for an hour, no pressure. Whatever she decided about the wedding was still entirely hers to decide. I told her I loved her no matter what. She came. I sat her down at that same kitchen table where she used to do her algebra homework, and I told her everything, as gently and as factually as I could. I didn't call Grant a monster. I didn't tell her she was foolish. I laid the documents out one at a time. Harold's notes, Marcus's report with the Florida court filings, Priya's written account, and I let her read them herself in her own time, at her own pace, while I sat quietly across from her and let her feel whatever she needed to feel. I watched my daughter's face go through things I hope I never have to watch again. Confusion, disbelief, anger, some of it for one terrible half hour aimed at me because some small, protective part of her wanted so badly for it not to be true that she needed somewhere to put the pain. I let her be angry. I didn't defend myself. I just stayed at that table. And then, slowly, she got very quiet, and she started connecting things on her own. A comment Grant had made in January that hadn't quite sat right with her at the time. A strange conversation about simplifying the family finances after the wedding. The way he'd always seemed to have an answer ready whenever she brought up missing me. "He asked me not to invite you," she finally said, very quietly, staring at the papers. "He told me it would be better. He said you'd probably cause a scene about the money from Grandma Ruth's land, that you'd never really let go of it, that you'd bring it up in front of his family and embarrass everyone." There it was, the lie that closed the circle. I didn't say "I told you so." I just reached across the table and took my daughter's hand, the way I used to when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. And I told her that whatever she decided to do next, postpone the wedding, go through with it, confront him, walk away entirely, I would support her completely, and I would be there. Emily didn't cancel the wedding. I want to be honest with you about that, because this isn't a story where everything gets fixed with one conversation at a kitchen table. She told me she needed to see it through to the end, on her terms this time, with her eyes open. She asked me one question before she left that night. "Will you come, Dad, if I want you there?" "I will always come," I told her. "Every single time, that's never once been the question." The wedding was held at a vineyard venue outside Dublin, Ohio, on a Saturday evening in late April. I want you to understand, I did not go there to expose anyone in front of 200 guests. I went because my daughter asked her father to be there, and after everything, that was the only invitation that mattered to me. I sat quietly near the back during the ceremony, and when it came time for the vows, Emily did something none of us expected, including, I believe, Grant himself. She had written her own vows, and instead of reading the ones the wedding planner had helped polish weeks earlier, she folded that paper closed and spoke without it. She talked about honesty, about how a marriage has to be built on truth or it isn't built on anything at all. She looked at Grant, and in front of his family, her family, and every guest in that room, she said she had learned something important in the last 2 weeks about what it means to really know the person standing across from you, and that she was grateful, more grateful than she could say, that she had learned it before making promises she couldn't take back. Then she turned, walked off the small platform, and came and stood next to me. There was no shouting, no scene, exactly as I'd promised Grant there wouldn't be. Just 200 people watching a bride walk away from an altar with quiet dignity, and a father standing up from the third row to meet his daughter halfway. Grant's family understood, I think, faster than Grant did what had actually happened, because his mother left the venue within the hour without speaking to anyone. Whatever conversations happened in that family after that day, I wasn't part of them, and honestly, I never wanted to be. My part in this story was never about winning against Grant Sorensen. It was about making sure my daughter had the truth in her hands before she made the biggest decision of her life. I won't pretend the months after that were easy for Emily. Ending an engagement in front of 200 people is not a small thing, and there were nights I sat up with her on the phone while she cried, working through humiliation and grief and anger, sometimes all three within the same conversation. But there were other nights too, nights she called just to talk. The way she used to before all of this started, nights we ordered pizza and watched bad movies in my living room and laughed the way we used to when she was 17. 6 months later, Emily used part of the Licking County land, once it fully transferred to her on her 30th birthday, to help fund the first phase of her own small structural engineering firm, a company she named, with a grin I hadn't seen in a long time, Whitfield Engineering. She told me she wanted the name to mean something different for the both of us going forward. She still hasn't found the man she'll eventually marry, and honestly, she's told me she isn't in any hurry. But last month, on a Sunday afternoon, she showed up at my house unannounced with a box of the same donuts we used to get after her softball games when she was a girl. And we sat on the back porch for 3 hours, not talking about Grant, not talking about the wedding, just talking about her work and my company and nothing important at all. The kind of conversation you don't realize you missed until you have it again. I think about that phone call sometimes, the one where she asked me not to come. I understand now that it was never really her voice asking me that. It was a lie wearing her voice, And it took patience and evidence and a whole lot of quiet, sleepless nights for the truth to finally push that lie aside and let my daughter's real voice come back through. I didn't get revenge in the way people usually mean that word. I never raised my voice at Grant Sorensen. I never humiliated him publicly, never so much as spoke to him again after that rainy Tuesday at the diner. All I ever did was refuse to let a lie stand unchallenged and give my daughter the one thing every person deserves before they make a promise that's supposed to last a lifetime: the truth, laid out plainly so she could choose for herself. That, it turns out, was more than enough. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe to Raw Revenge, and tell me where you're watching from. I'll see you in the next story.